The hammer of boot heels on warped planks. A woman's trembling hand clutches a parcel of flour to her chest, as though it were the last thing left to her in this world. Texas, August, the year of our Lord, 1873. The sun hangs over the town of Copper Falls like a forge that never cools. Red dust rolls in slow waves beneath the hooves of horses, settling on porch rails, settling on the faces of those who stand and watch, faces that will not move, no matter what comes next. At the far end of the street, the door of a general store swings open. 3 shadows spill down the wooden steps. A man's voice rises, sweet as honey laced with poison. There she is. The thief. The woman turns. Slowly, very slowly. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, the hooves of a stranger's horse strike the hard-packed road. He does not know yet. She does not know yet, but the red dust of Copper Falls. It is about to be watered with something other than rain, something darker, something that does not wash away. The dust of Copper Falls ran red that August day in 1873. Not from drought, from blood. Marlowe Ashford's blood. She stood outside Mercer's general store, her threadbare dress clinging to her thin frame, a small bundle clutched in her arms. Flour, sugar, a bit of salted pork. The meager supplies that would see her through another week of scraping by in the widow's shack at the edge of town. 23 years old, 2 years a widow, Zello prospects. The coins she'd used to pay for those goods had been earned honestly, painfully, through taking in washing and mending from the few families charitable enough to offer work to a woman with no family, no protection, no standing in the rigid social order of frontier Texas. She'd just stepped off the wooden boardwalk when she heard his voice. There she is. The thief. Fear crawled up her spine, despite the heat. Despite the Texas sun hanging in the sky like a forge fire, radiating waves that made the very air shimmer above the rutted Main Street, she knew that voice. Gideon Mercer, son of the store's owner. A young man whose sense of entitlement exceeded his intelligence by a considerable margin. 26 years old, all swagger. No substance. Marlowe turned slowly, carefully, her hands tightening on her bundle. Gideon stood in the doorway of his father's store, his face flushed, not just from heat, from malicious purpose. Behind him stood 2 shadows, Colt Dawson, ranch hand with a reputation for cruelty, and Jesse Rourke, weak chin, weaker character. The perfect follower for any man mean enough to lead. I don't know what you're talking about. Marlowe's voice came out steady, despite the fear beginning to coil in her stomach. I paid for everything in this bundle. Your father took my money not 5 minutes ago, liar. Gideon descended the steps, his boots hammering against the wood. You took money from the register. I saw you. My father's old. His eyes are failing, but mine worked just fine. It was a lie. Marlowe knew it. Gideon knew it. And she suspected, with a sinking certainty, that this had nothing to do with theft and everything to do with the night 2 weeks prior, when Gideon had cornered her behind the saloon, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her face, trying to kiss her, to paw at her dress, to take what she had no intention of giving. She'd slapped him then, hard enough to leave a mark, hard enough to wound his pride in front of the 2 friends who'd been watching. This was revenge. Simple, cruel. Wrapped in the respectable clothing of civic duty. I took nothing. Marlowe lifted her chin, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. You're angry because I won't. Shut your lying mouth. Gideon closed the distance in 3 quick strides, and before Marlowe could react, he'd grabbed the bundle from her arms and hurled it into the street. Floor exploded in a white cloud. The precious pork landed in a puddle of standing water. Sugar scattered across the dust like dirty snow. Marlowe stared at her ruined supplies. A week's food, a week's hard-earned money, gone in an instant. Something inside her snapped. You bastard. The word came out breathless. Then louder. You cowardly. Lying. Bastard. Gideon's hand cracked across her face. The blow sent her stumbling. She might have fallen if she hadn't caught herself against a hitching post. Her cheek blazed with pain. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. I'll teach you respect. Gideon snarled, advancing on her. "I'll teach you what happens to women who think they're too good for a Mercer." Marlowe tried to run. She made it perhaps 3 steps before Colt Dawson caught her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. He yanked her backward, and she collided with Jesse Rourke, who shoved her forward again, directly into Gideon's fist. This blow caught her in the stomach, driving the air from her lungs in a painful whoosh. Marlowe doubled over, gasping, her vision sparking with black dots. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard laughter, male laughter, cruel and delighted. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Gideon's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Not so quick with that sharp tongue?" A boot caught her in the ribs. She couldn't tell whose. Marlowe went down hard, her palms scraping against the rough dirt of the street. She tried to curl into herself, to protect her vital organs, the way a wounded animal might. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong. Another kick, this one to her back. Pain exploded along her spine. Marlowe cried out, the sound torn from her throat before she could stop it. And that cry seemed to excite them further. "Should have been nicer to Gideon," Colt said, his voice thick with satisfaction as his boot connected with her shoulder. "Should have shown some gratitude when a good man like him took an interest." Marlowe's face pressed against the dirt now, red dust filling her nose and mouth. She could taste it, could feel it grinding between her teeth, above her. The 3 men circled like wolves around a downed deer, taking turns delivering blows that felt like they were breaking her apart from the inside, through the haze of pain. Marlowe became aware of something almost worse than the beating itself, silence, the awful, condemning silence of the other people on the street. She could see them, could see their boots and the hems of their skirts as they stood on the boardwalks, watching Mrs. Henderson from the dress shop, Tom Miller, who ran the stable, even Sheriff Tucker, whose job it was to protect people like her. No one moved, no one spoke, no one helped. This was the way of things in Copper Falls. Gideon Mercer was the son of one of the town's most prosperous merchants. Colt and Jesse worked for the McGraw Ranch, which owned half the land in the county. They had standing, connections, power. Marlowe Ashford was nobody, a widow woman with no family, no money, no friends willing to risk themselves on her behalf in the harsh arithmetic of frontier justice. She counted for nothing at all. That's enough now. Boys, a new voice. Sheriff Tucker, his tone weary rather than authoritative. "You've made your point. Let her be." "She's a thief," Gideon panted, his face flushed with exertion. "She needs to learn. She's learned," the sheriff said. "Any more, and you'll have to answer for it. Even a woman like that don't deserve to be beat to death in the street. A woman like that." The words cut deeper than any boot or fist. Marlowe squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear, to die, to simply cease existing in this moment of absolute humiliation and pain. Gideon spat in the dirt, inches from her face. "All right then. Reckon she knows her place now." Their footsteps retreated. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, eager to return to the mundane business of their mundane lives. Within moments, the street was nearly empty again, as if nothing had happened at all. Marlowe lay in the dirt, each breath a knife in her ribs, and tried to move. Her right arm responded sluggishly. Her left didn't respond at all. Something was broken inside her. She could feel it, could feel the wrongness in her body like a discordant note in a familiar song. She managed to roll onto her side, a movement that sent fresh waves of agony cascading through her torso. Her vision swam, her dress was torn. She realized dimly, torn and soaked with blood and dust and God knew what else. She must look like something dragged behind a horse. "Get up," she told herself fiercely. "Get up before they come back. Get up and run and hide and maybe you'll survive this." But her body wouldn't obey. She was broken. They'd broken her. And as she lay there in the red Texas dust, under the merciless August sun, Marlowe Ashford felt something inside her begin to crack, something deeper than bone. more essential than flesh, hope. Hope was finally, irrevocably, breaking. She'd held on to it for so long. Through her husband Henry's death from consumption 2 years prior. Through the loss of their small room above the cobbler's shop when she couldn't pay rent alone. Through every slight and insult and wandering hand in this miserable town. She'd told herself that if she just worked hard enough, kept her head down, minded her manners, things would get better. But things didn't get better. Not for women like her, not in places like this. Just close your eyes, she thought. Close your eyes and let go. It'll be easier that way. The sun was making her dizzy. Or maybe that was blood loss. Or maybe both. Marlowe's eyes began to drift shut, her consciousness starting to slip away from the pain, from the humiliation, from the awful knowing that nobody cared whether she lived or died. Then she heard it, a sound so ordinary, so out of place, that at first she thought she might be hallucinating. The steady, rhythmic clip-clop of a horse's hooves on hard-packed earth. The sound grew closer, stopped. She heard leather creaking, a saddle settling as its rider dismounted, bootons on the ground, moving toward her with purposeful strides. Jesus Christ, a man's voice, deep and rough, carrying an accent that suggested origins somewhere north and east of Texas. A voice Marlowe had never heard before. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the brutal sunlight. A shape moved into her limited field of vision, blocking out the sun, and for a moment all Marlowe could see was a silhouette. Broad shoulders, a wide-brimmed hat, the unmistakable outline of a gun belt, slung low on narrow hips. Then he crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, and Marlowe found herself looking into the most extraordinary eyes she'd ever seen. Gray, not the soft gray of morning mist, but the dark, turbulent gray of storm clouds rolling in before a twister. Eyes that had seen violence and delivered it. Eyes that missed nothing. Eyes that looked at her not with pity or disgust, but with something she couldn't quite name, the look of someone who understood loss. "Easy now," the man said softly. "Don't try to move. Let me look at you first." His hands, large, calloused, surprisingly gentle, moved over her with practiced efficiency, checking for breaks, assessing damage. Marlowe wanted to tell him to stop, that she was fine, that he should just leave her alone before Gideon and his friends decided to come back and start on him too. But she couldn't seem to make her voice work, so she just lay there, barely breathing. While this stranger's careful hands catalogued her injuries, 3 ribs broken, he sat back on his heels, his jaw tight with what looked like barely controlled anger. Left shoulder dislocated, severe bruising over most of your torso and back, cuts and abrasions. Possible concussion, he paused. "Who did this to you?" Marlowe managed to work her mouth enough to croak out a single word. Don't what? Don't ask. Don't get involved. They'll what?" The man's voice had gone very quiet, and Marlowe had heard enough violence in her life to recognize the particular quality of that quiet. It was the stillness before a gun fired. "Tell me their names, please," Marlowe whispered. "Just leave me. Not your problem." Something shifted in those gray eyes. Something that might have been pain, or might have been fury, or might have been both. The man stood up, his movements fluid despite his size, and Marlowe heard the distinctive sound of a revolver being drawn from its holster. "Oh God," she thought. "He's going to start shooting. There's going to be more blood, more death." But the gun didn't fire. Instead, the man walked a few paces away from her, his boots crunching in the dirt, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the nearly empty street with the clarity of a bell. "The men who did this, I know you're watching. I know you're close by, feeling real proud of yourselves for beating on a woman half your size." A pause, loaded with menace. "I'm giving you one chance to make this right. One chance to come out here and face someone who can fight back." Silence. Marlowe tried to turn her head to see what was happening, but the movement sent such a wave of nausea through her that she had to stop, breathing hard through her nose. "No? Nobody wants to step up?" The man's voice dripped with contempt. "Didn't think so. Cowards rarely do. He holstered his gun and returned to Marlowe's side, and this time when he crouched down. There was a softness in his expression that contrasted sharply with the hardness in his voice moments before. "I'm going to pick you up now," he said. "It's going to hurt. I'm sorry for that. But I can't leave you lying in the street like this. Don't." Marlowe tried to protest, but her voice failed again. "Yeah, I know. Not my problem. Don't get involved." The man slipped one arm under her knees, another behind her shoulders, cradling her broken body against his chest as he stood. "Well, I never was good at minding my own business." The pain of being moved was extraordinary. Marlowe couldn't help the cry that escaped her lips, couldn't stop the tears that spilled from her eyes, but through it all, she was aware of how steady he held her, the way he adjusted his grip to cause her the least possible discomfort. The gentleness with which he navigated the step up onto the boardwalk. "Doc Brennan," he called out. "I need you now." A door opened somewhere to Marlowe's right. Good Lord. What happened? What does it look like happened? The man's voice was tight with controlled rage. "Three men decided to teach a lesson to a woman who couldn't defend herself. Bring her inside. Where do you want her?" "Back room." This way. Marlowe felt herself being carried through a doorway into blessedly cool dimness. The smell of carbolic and laudanum filled her nose, the distinctive scent of a doctor's surgery. She was lowered onto something soft, a table, maybe, or a cot. "I'll need to examine her properly," Doc Brennan was saying. "You'll have to wait outside. Like hell I will. This is a medical examination, not a public spectacle." Out. A long pause then, incredibly. Marlowe felt a hand close gently around hers, the stranger's hand. Rough and warm and somehow comforting. "I'll be right outside that door," he said. And though he was speaking to the doctor, Marlowe knew the words were meant for her. "Nobody's going to hurt you again. I give you my word on that." Marlowe wanted to tell him that words didn't mean much in Copper Falls, that promises were as worthless as Confederate script, that he should just leave while he still could. But she was so tired, and the pain was so immense, and there was something in his voice, some fundamental quality of steadiness, that made her want to believe him. So instead of protesting, she squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. The pressure was returned, firm and reassuring, then the hand withdrew, and Marlowe heard boots moving away, a door opening and closing. "All right, Miss," Doc Brennan said, his voice kind but clinical. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." Outside the doctor's office, Dalton Thorne stood with his back against the wall, his hand resting on the butt of his Remington, watching the street with eyes that missed nothing. He'd ridden into Copper Falls not 20 minutes ago, looking for nothing more than a hot meal and a bed that didn't move under him like his horse did. Instead, he'd found a woman being beaten in the street while good people looked the other way. He'd seen a lot of ugly things in his 31 years. He'd fought Comanche raiders on the Llano Estacado. He'd hunted outlaws through the brush country as a frontier lawman. He'd stood over dead men he'd killed and felt nothing but relief that it was them instead of him. But there was something about seeing that woman curled in the dirt, something about the way nobody moved to help her, that had lit a fire in his chest he'd thought long extinguished. Maybe it was because she reminded him of someone. Maybe it was just the principle of the thing. Or maybe, and Dalton suspected this was the real truth, maybe he was just tired of watching people suffer while other people profited from it. He'd been a lawman for 8 years before everything went to hell. He'd believed in justice then, believed in order, in the idea that good men could make a difference if they just tried hard enough. Then Silas Crow had taught him differently, had shown him in the most brutal way possible that sometimes the law wasn't enough, that sometimes evil won, that sometimes good men died while bad men prospered. Dalton's hand tightened on his gun as the memory tried to surface. Abigail's face, the children's voices, the smell of smoke and blood and burning wood. He forced it down, shoved it back into the locked box in his mind. where he kept all the things he couldn't afford to think about and still function. The door opened behind him. Doc Brennan stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag that was stained with blood. "Well?" Dalton asked. "3 ribs broken, 1 cracked, left shoulder dislocated. I got it back in, but she'll need to keep it immobilized. Severe bruising over most of her torso and back, cuts and abrasions. Possible concussion." The doctor's mouth was tight. "She's lucky they didn't kill her." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Dalton said flatly. "They stopped because someone told them to. Sheriff, probably. Didn't want the inconvenience of an actual corpse." Doc Brennan sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-odd years. "You're not wrong. Gideon Mercer and his friends. They've been getting away with things for a while now. Smaller things than this. But, well, Gideon's father is wealthy, and the boys work for wealthy men. That counts for a lot around here. It shouldn't, no. But it does." The doctor met Dalton's eyes. "You planning to do something stupid about this?" "Depends on your definition of stupid, Mr. Thorne, Dalton Thorne, Mr. Thorne. I appreciate what you did, getting her off the street, bringing her here. But if you're thinking about going after Gideon and his friends, I'd advise against it. They've got protection. You don't." "I don't need protection," Dalton said softly. "I need about 30 seconds and clear line of sight. That kind of thinking will get you hanged or shot." "Probably both." Dalton turned to look fully at the doctor, and something in his expression must have communicated itself clearly, because Brennan actually took a step back. "I've been shot before," Dalton said. "Hasn't taken yet. And as for hanging," he shrugged, "they'd have to catch me first." Before the doctor could respond, the door opened again, and a woman stuck her head out. Brennan's wife. Dalton guessed from the proprietary way she looked at the doctor. "She's asking for you," Mrs. Brennan said, looking at Dalton. "The girl, she wants to talk to you." Dalton pushed off the wall and moved toward the door. But Doc Brennan caught his arm. "Don't make promises you can't keep," the old man said quietly. "That girl's been disappointed enough for one lifetime." "Then I won't make promises," Dalton replied. "I'll just tell her the truth." He stepped into the back room, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The woman. The girl, really. Though God knew she'd probably aged 10 years in the last hour. Lay on a cot against the far wall, her torso wrapped in bandages, her left arm in a sling, her face a mask of purple and yellow bruises. Someone had cleaned the blood and dirt away. But there was no hiding the damage, yet when she looked at him, her eyes were clear, hurt and wary. Yes, but clear, unbroken in the ways that mattered most. "You're still here," she said. Her voice rough but steady. "Told you I would be. Most men lie. I'm not most men." The girl studied him for a long moment, and Dalton had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured. Of this battered woman somehow, seeing through all the walls he'd built around himself. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked. It was a fair question. Dalton considered several answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because nobody else would. Because he couldn't them all as insufficient. He discarded them all. "Once," he said slowly, "I rode past someone who needed help. I was in a hurry, had somewhere to be, someone to chase. Figured somebody else would stop, somebody else would help." He paused, the memory tasting like ash. "Nobody did. And by the time I came back through that way, it was too late." "What happened to them?" "They died, because I didn't stop." Dalton met her eyes squarely. "I don't ride past anymore." The girl absorbed this, her fingers plucking at the blanket covering her legs. "The men who did this, Gideon Mercer, Colt Dawson, Jesse Rourke, they'll do it again if they see me. Or worse. And the law won't stop them. Sheriff Tucker's been in the Mercer's pocket for years. Then the laws failed," Dalton said simply. "Wouldn't be the first time. So what do I do? Hide? Run? Both of those just put off the inevitable. Or you could come with me." The words surprised him almost as much as they clearly surprised her. Dalton hadn't planned to say them. Hadn't even consciously thought them. But as soon as they left his mouth, he knew they were right. Come with you where? The girl asked warily. I've got a ranch about 15 miles north of here. Small place, not much to look at. But it's mine, clear and free. House needs work. Could use someone to help with that, he shrugged. Could use the company if I'm being honest. It gets quiet out there alone. You don't know anything about me. Know you're brave. Know you're tough. Know you could have just laid down and died out there. But you kept fighting. Dalton tilted his head. Know you didn't deserve what happened to you. That's enough for me. I don't need charity, the girl said, and there was steel in her voice despite its roughness. Good. Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work you'd earn your keep. Cooking, cleaning, helping with the house, and maybe the stock if you're interested in learning. I'd pay you fair wages, give you your own room. Expect you to pull your weight. He paused. Only difference between you and any other ranch hand is you'd be sleeping inside instead of in the bunks. How? And that's all you'd expect? Work? Dalton understood the real question. Understood the fear behind it. He'd seen what men could do to women they had power over. Hell, he'd arrested more than a few of them back in his lawman days. That's all, he said firmly. I'm not, he stopped. Searching for words, I'm not that kind of man. Won't claim to be a saint, but I don't force myself on women. Don't hurt people who can't fight back. Don't much like people who do, he held her gaze. You'd be safe. I swear it on whatever you want me to swear on. The girl was quiet for so long that Dalton thought she might refuse then. Slowly, she nodded. All right, she said softly. All right, Mr. Thorne. I'll come with you. Dalton, he corrected. Just Dalton. Marlowe, she replied. Marlowe Ashford, pleased to meet you properly. Marlowe. Dalton touched the brim of his hat, though I wish it was under better circumstances. Me too, Marlowe said, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across her battered face. Me too. 3 days later, just before dawn. Dalton helped Marlowe into the wagon he'd procured from the town's livery. Doc Brennan had wanted her to rest longer, but Marlowe had been adamant. She wanted out of Copper Falls as soon as physically possible. And Dalton couldn't blame her. The town was stirring as they drove through. Early risers beginning their morning routines. Smoke starting to curl from chimneys. A few people stared as the wagon passed. But nobody spoke. Nobody waved. These were the same people who'd watched Marlowe get beaten and done nothing. Dalton would remember every face. They were almost clear of the town limits when 3 men stepped into the road ahead, forcing Dalton to pull back on the reins. Gideon Mercer, Colt Dawson, Jess Rourke. Dalton felt Marlowe go rigid beside him, felt her fear like a palpable thing. His right hand dropped casually to rest on his thigh, inches from his holstered Remington. Morning. Boys, he said pleasantly. Something I can help you with? That's our property you got there, Gideon said, gesturing toward Marlowe. She owes Mr. Mercer money. Stole from his store. Can't just let her ride off before she pays what's owed, funny, Dalton replied, his voice still light. Doc Brennan told me she paid for everything she took. Said your father confirmed it. So either the doc's lying, or you are, he paused. I'm inclined to believe the doc. You calling me a liar? Gideon's hand moved toward his gun. No need to call you what you obviously are. Now, step aside. Or what? Colt had moved to flank them, his own hand on his weapon. You gonna take on all 3 of us? Bad odds. Stranger, Dalton smiled. But there was nothing friendly in it. Tell you what. We'll make it sporting. I'll give you the first move. You want to draw on me? Go ahead. See how that works out for you. For a long moment. Nobody moved. The morning air was so still that Dalton could hear Jesse Rourke breathing. Could see the sweat beading on Gideon Mercer's forehead. Despite the cool temperature, they were calculating, weighing their odds, 3 against 1. Except Dalton had positioned himself in a way that gave him clear sight lines to all 3 men, and his hand was already near his gun, while theirs would have to travel farther, and there was something in his eyes. That flat, dead calm that came from having killed men before and knowing he could do it again. That made even brave men reconsider. Gideon Mercer was not a brave man. "This ain't over," he said. But he was already stepping back, already backing down. "You can't protect her forever." "Don't need forever," Dalton replied. "Just need today now." Move they moved. Dalton clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. Passing between the three men, Marlowe didn't relax until they were a good mile out of town. Until Copper Falls was nothing but a collection of buildings shrinking behind them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Nothing to thank me for. You could have just given me up." "Would have been easier." Dalton glanced at her. At this woman who'd taken a beating that would have broken most men and was still sitting upright. Still looking forward instead of back. "Where I come from," he said, "we don't give up our people. And as of 3 days ago, Miss Ashford, you're my people. Better get used to it." Marlowe didn't respond, but Dalton saw her shoulders relax slightly. Saw something in her eyes that might have been the first fragile stirring of hope. They rode on as the sun climbed higher. The wagon wheels turning. The horses steady. Two broken people heading toward something that might, if they were lucky, if they were careful, if they were brave enough, be a second chance behind them. Copper Falls faded into the distance. Ahead, the future waited, uncertain and dangerous and possible. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Marlowe Ashford thought she might actually live to see it. The ranch appeared on the horizon, just as the sun reached its zenith, shimmering in the heat like something out of a fever dream. Marlowe had dozed fitfully during the journey, her body demanding rest despite her mind's refusal to fully surrender consciousness. Each jolt of the wagon sent fresh pain through her broken ribs, each breath a reminder of what Gideon Mercer and his friends had done to her. But she didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change anything. And besides, she'd learned long ago that nobody really wanted to hear about a woman's pain. "Almost there," Dalton said, his voice cutting through her half-sleeping state. "Not much to look at, but it's home." Marlowe forced her eyes open and looked where he was pointing. The ranch sat in a small valley between two gentle rises of land, protected from the worst of the wind, but still open enough to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the relentless Texas heat. The house itself was modest. A single-story structure of rough-hewn logs and plank siding, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. The roof looked sound, at least from this distance, though the whole place had an air of neglect about it, as if its owner had been going through the motions of living, without really inhabiting the space. Behind the house stood a barn, red paint faded to a rusty brown, and beyond that, a series of corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair. She could see horses in one of the corrals, 3 of them, sturdy-looking animals that raised their heads to watch as the wagon approached. "It needs work," Dalton continued, and Marlowe detected something almost apologetic in his tone. "Place kind of got away from me these past couple years. But the bones are good, built it myself. Mostly. Foundation solid, walls are tight. Roof doesn't leak. Much, it's fine," Marlowe said, and meant it, compared to the widow's shack she'd been living in back in Copper Falls. A place barely larger than a chicken coop, with gaps in the walls wide enough to see daylight through. This looked like a palace. "It's more than fine." Dalton guided the wagon up to the house and set the brake. Before Marlowe could attempt to climb down herself, he was around to her side. Reaching up to help her, his hands were careful, mindful of her injuries, and Marlowe found herself once again struck by the contradiction this man presented. So clearly capable of violence, yet so unexpectedly gentle. "Easy now," he murmured as her feet touched the ground. "Don't need you pulling anything loose that Doc Brennan put back together." Marlowe stood for a moment, letting her body adjust to being upright again, and looked around with clearer eyes, up close. The ranch showed more signs of neglect than she'd noticed from a foot distance. The porch boards needed replacing in spots. Weeds had overtaken what might once have been a kitchen garden. One of the shutters hung crooked on its hinges, but underneath the neglect, she could see evidence of care: the careful joinery of the porch posts, the neat stone foundation, the way the whole structure had been positioned to catch the morning sun while staying shaded in the afternoon. "You said you built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Had help with the heavy timber work. But yeah, the rest was me." Dalton moved past her to unlock the front door. "Built it about 5 years back when I thought." He stopped abruptly, and Marlowe saw his jaw tighten. "Well, when things were different." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. And after a moment's hesitation, Marlowe followed. The interior was dim and cool after the brightness outside, and it took Marlowe's eyes a moment to adjust when they did. She found herself standing in a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cast-iron stove set into it for cooking. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the space. Against another wall stood a dresser, and what looked like a rocking chair. Though it was covered with a sheet, everything was covered with a fine layer of dust. And the air had that stale quality of a place that hadn't been properly lived in for a long time. "Like I said," Dalton muttered, surveying the space with what looked like embarrassment. "Needs work, it just needs cleaning," Marlowe replied, running a finger along the table and examining the dust that came away, and maybe airing out. "Nothing that can't be fixed with elbow grease in time." "Your room's through here." Dalton crossed to a door on the right side of the main room and pushed it open. "Used to be." He stopped again. "It's yours now. Has a real bed. Not just a cot. Window faces east, so you'll get morning light. There's hooks on the wall for hanging clothes, and a trunk for storage." Marlowe moved to the doorway and peered inside. The room was small but adequate, with a single window covered by faded curtains, a narrow bed with a bare mattress, and the promised hooks and trunk, like the main room. Everything was covered in dust, but the bones were good. She could make this work. "It's perfect," she said, and saw something like relief flicker across Dalton's face. "All right then, I'll bring in your things." "Well, you don't really have things, do you?" Doc Brennan's wife packed a bag with some clothes she thought might fit. "I'll grab that." He paused in the doorway, seeming suddenly uncertain. "You should rest. I know you're probably sick of hearing that, but you took a hell of a beating. And the wagon ride out here didn't help. I've got work to do outside anyway. Horses need tending. Fence line needs checking. You just make yourself comfortable." "Such as it is, Dalton," Marlowe said, and he turned back. "Thank you for all of this. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know I mean it. You didn't have to do any of this." He looked at her for a long moment, and Marlowe saw something complicated and painful move behind his eyes. "Yeah," he said finally. "I did. Get some rest." Marlowe. Then he was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The front door closing behind him with a solid thunk, Marlowe stood alone in the main room of Dalton Thorne's house, listening to the silence. It was different from the silence of Copper Falls. That had been the silence of people deliberately looking away, of cowardice dressed up as neutrality. This was just the natural quiet of a place far from other people, broken only by the distant sound of horses and the creak of wood settling in the heat. She should rest. She knew that her body was screaming for it. Every breath, a reminder of her broken ribs. Every movement sending fresh aches through her bruised muscles. But Marlowe had never been good at resting, had never been able to simply sit still when there was work to be done. And looking around this dusty house, she could see plenty of work that needed doing. Besides, if she laid down now, she'd think, and thinking would lead her back to Copper Falls, back to Gideon Mercer's fists and boots, back to the faces of all those people who'd watched and done nothing. She couldn't afford to go back there, not even in her mind, not yet, maybe not ever. So instead, Marlowe set about making this house into something that felt less like a tomb and more like a home. She started with the basics. opening windows to let in fresh air, sweeping dust from surfaces, shaking out the sheet that covered the rocking chair. The work was harder than it should have been, her injuries making every movement an exercise in careful calculation. Reaching above her head pulled at her broken ribs. Bending down made her dizzy. But she persisted, moving slowly and methodically, taking breaks when the pain got too intense, then starting again when it became bearable. As she worked, Marlowe began to notice things about the house. Small things that told stories about the man who lived here. The way the kitchen was laid out with surprising efficiency. Everything within easy reach, suggesting someone who actually cooked rather than just heating beans from a can. The books on a shelf near the fireplace, not many, but well-worn, suggesting they'd been read multiple times. Poetry. She saw with some surprise Walt Whitman. Emily Dickinson, not what she would have expected from a man who wore his gun with such casual competence. And then there were the things that suggested pain. The sheet-covered rocking chair that looked like it hadn't been uncovered in years. The door to what must be Dalton's bedroom, firmly shut, with a heaviness about it that suggested he didn't go in there any more than absolutely necessary. The photograph on the mantel, the only photograph in the whole house, that she couldn't quite see from where she stood, but could tell showed people, a family. Maybe that Dalton clearly couldn't bear to look at, but equally couldn't bear to pack away. This house was haunted. Marlowe realized, not by ghosts in the supernatural sense, but by memories, by loss, by whatever had happened to turn a clearly capable, intelligent man into someone who'd let his home fall into neglect, and eat his meals standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table he'd built with his own hands. Marlowe knew about that kind of haunting. She'd lived with it herself since Henry died. The way certain things, the smell of leather, the sound of a hammer on an anvil, the sight of a man's hands doing fine work, could transport her back to when her husband was alive, when her future had looked different, when she'd believed the world was fundamentally fair. But, unlike Dalton, Marlowe hadn't had the luxury of wallowing in her grief. She'd had to survive, had to keep moving, had to push through the pain because stopping meant death. Maybe. Metaphorical, if not literal. Maybe that's what Dalton needed too, a reason to keep moving, to stop just going through the motions and start actually living again. She was contemplating this, standing in front of that sheet-covered rocking chair, when the front door opened and Dalton came in carrying a bucket of water. Jesus Christ. Woman, he said, stopping short when he saw her. I told you to rest. Not clean the whole damn house. I rested, Marlowe lied, and I needed something to do. Couldn't just lie in bed staring at the ceiling. Dalton set the bucket down with a thump. You're white as a ghost and swaying on your feet. Sit down before you fall down. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're beat to hell, and barely holding yourself together through sheer stubbornness. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and took her arm, gently. Always gently, steering her toward one of the chairs at the table. Sit. That's not a request. Marlowe sat mostly because her legs had started trembling, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay upright. The room tilted slightly, and she gripped the edge of the table until it steadied. You're going to hurt yourself, Dalton said, and now he sounded more worried than angry. Doc Brennan said, you need at least a week of rest for those ribs to start healing properly. Throwing yourself into housework on your first day here isn't going to help anything. I needed to be useful, Marlowe said quietly. I needed to feel like I wasn't just taking from you, like I was earning my place here. Dalton pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, running a hand through his dark hair in what looked like a habitual gesture of frustration. Marlowe, listen to me. You don't have to earn anything. Not yet. Not until you're healed up enough to actually work without doing yourself more damage. Right now, your job is to get better. That's it? I don't know how to just be, Marlowe admitted. I've been working since I was 6 years old, taking care of my mama when she was sick, helping my daddy with the farm, then taking care of my husband, then taking in washing and mending after he died. I don't know how to sit still and let someone else take care of things. Then you're going to learn, Dalton said firmly. Starting now, you're going to eat something. I'll cook, such as it is. And then you're going to go to bed and sleep until your body tells you to wake up. No arguments. Marlowe wanted to argue anyway, wanted to insist that she was fine, that she didn't need coddling, that she could handle more than he gave her credit for. But looking at his face, at the set of his jaw and the determined look in those gray eyes, she realized that arguing would be pointless. Dalton Thorne had made up his mind, and Marlowe suspected that once he did that, moving him was about as easy as moving a mountain. All right, she said finally, but tomorrow we'll see how you feel. One day at a time, Marlowe. That's how this works. He stood and moved to the kitchen area, pulling ingredients from the shelves in the cold box: salt pork, beans, some withered potatoes, a few sad-looking onions. Nothing fancy. But Marlowe's stomach growled at the thought of actual food. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal before the beating. Certainly, before Gideon Mercer's fist had driven into her stomach and made her throw up what little she'd had in there. She watched Dalton work, noting the economical efficiency of his movements, the way he wielded a knife with the same casual competence he showed with his gun. He didn't talk while he cooked. And Marlowe didn't try to force conversation. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable, companionable in a way that felt rare and precious. The food, when he served it, was simple but good. Beans and salt pork fried up with the potatoes and onions, seasoned with salt and pepper, and something else she couldn't quite identify. They ate at the table, and Marlowe tried not to think about how long it had probably been since Dalton had actually sat down for a meal like a civilized person. Instead of eating standing up or not at all. "You're a good cook," she said after a few bites. "I'm a functional cook," Dalton corrected. "There's a difference, my wife." He stopped abruptly, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, and Marlowe saw the color drain from his face. It was the first time he'd mentioned having a wife, and from his reaction, Marlowe understood that it hadn't been intentional. "You don't have to talk about it," she said softly. "Not if you don't want to." Dalton set his fork down, his appetite apparently gone. "Her name was Abigail," he said, his voice rough. "She was the one who was good at cooking, made things taste like they actually mattered. You know, like meals were occasions, not just fuel." He stared at his plate. "I haven't sat at this table since," he paused. "It's been 3 years. I haven't been able to." Marlowe's heart ached for him, for the pain so clearly visible in every line of his body. "What happened?" she asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's—" Dalton rubbed his face with both hands. "You should know. If you're going to be living here, you should know what. Why I am the way I am." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the lengthening shadows. When he spoke again, his voice was distant, as if he was recounting something that had happened to someone else. "I was a lawman, 8 years, frontier law, chasing outlaws and raiders, and every other kind of trouble you could imagine. Good at my job. Maybe too good. Made a name for myself tracking men nobody else could find." Dalton's hands gripped the windowsill, "And that's how I met Abigail. Her brother was a lawman too. Got himself shot up pretty bad going after a gang of cattle rustlers. I rode with him to the hospital in San Antonio, and there she was, his sister, taking care of him." A ghost of a smile crossed Dalton's face. "Prettiest woman I'd ever seen, smart too, and funny, and completely unimpressed by my reputation. We got married 6 months later, built this house the year after that. Had 2 kids, Nathaniel and Rosalie. Thought I had everything figured out." His hands gripped the windowsill, knuckles going white. "Then I got assigned to hunt Silas Crow. You heard of him?" Marlowe shook her head. "He is, one of the worst men I've ever had the misfortune to cross paths with. Killer, arsonist. Left a trail of bodies from the Rio Grande to the Oklahoma border. The law wanted him bad, and they gave me the job of bringing him in. I was so damn sure of myself. Certain I'd catch him. Make him pay for what he'd done. Dalton turned from the window, and Marlowe saw that his eyes were wet. I'd chased him for months. Got close a few times, but he always slipped away. And while I was off chasing ghosts, Silas sent his men here, to my home, to my family. Marlowe's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to hear the rest, didn't want to know the terrible thing that had broken this strong man so completely. But she couldn't bring herself to stop him either. They killed them, Dalton said flatly. Abigail, Nathaniel, Rosalie, burned the house, this house, with them inside it. Left a message carved into the barn door. Stop chasing or more people die. By the time I got word and rode back, there was nothing left but ashes and bodies. Oh God, Marlowe, whispered Dalton. I'm so sorry I quit the law that day. Couldn't stomach the idea of working for justice, when justice had failed me so completely. Rebuilt the house, had to. Needed something to do with my hands. Needed to, I don't know. Prove that Silas hadn't won completely, but I couldn't make it feel like home again. Every room, every corner. All I could see was them, what I'd lost, what I'd failed to protect. He moved back to the table but didn't sit. Just gripped the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. That's why I stopped when I saw you in the street. Because I couldn't. I couldn't ride past someone who needed help. Not again. Not after what happened when I was too busy, chasing the wrong thing to protect what mattered. Marlowe stood, ignoring the pain in her ribs, and crossed to where Dalton stood. She didn't touch him, didn't think he'd welcome it, but she positioned herself where he had to look at her instead of into the past. What happened to your family wasn't your fault, she said firmly. You didn't kill them. Silas Crow did. His men did. You were trying to protect other people from the same man who eventually hurt your family. There's no shame in that. I should have been here, Dalton said, his voice breaking. I should have protected them. You can't protect everyone from everything. Nobody can. The world's too cruel for that. Marlowe reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it gripped the chair. But you saved me. That has to count for something. Dalton looked down at her hand on his, and something in his expression shifted, not healing. Exactly. But maybe the first hint that healing might someday be possible. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe it does. They stood like that for a long moment, two broken people, finding unexpected solace in shared pain. Then Dalton gently extracted his hand and cleared his throat. You should get some rest, he said, his voice rough but steadier. It's been a long day, Marlowe wanted to argue. Wanted to stay and talk more, to somehow ease the terrible burden she could see him carrying. But her body had reached its limit. The combination of pain, exhaustion, and emotional intensity had left her feeling wrung out and hollow. All right, she agreed. But Dalton, thank you for telling me. For trusting me with that. He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. Good night. Marlowe, good night. Marlowe made her way to the small bedroom Dalton had given her. Each step an effort. The bed looked impossibly inviting, and she sank onto it with a groan of relief. Someone, Dalton she assumed, had made it up with clean sheets while she'd been cleaning the main room. The pillowcase smelled of soap and sunshine, and the mattress, while not fancy, was infinitely more comfortable than the thin pallet she'd been sleeping on in Copper Falls. She lay back carefully, arranging her battered body into the least painful position possible, and stared at the ceiling, through the thin walls. She could hear Dalton moving around in the main room, the clink of dishes being washed, the creak of floorboards. The sound of the door opening and closing as he went out to check on the horses one final time before full dark. Marlowe had thought she was too keyed up to sleep, her mind too full of everything that had happened. The beating, the rescue, the journey here, the terrible story of Dalton's loss. But her body had other ideas. Within minutes, she felt herself drifting, contentiousness slipping away. Her last coherent thought before sleep claimed her was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe, not because Dalton was some invincible protector, but because for once in her life, someone had chosen to stand with her instead of walking away. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Marlowe would wake with the sun, her body slowly adjusting to the absence of constant fear. She'd find breakfast waiting for her. Dalton was always up before dawn, had usually already done half a day's work by the time she emerged from her room. They'd eat together at the table, conversations gradually becoming easier, less weighted with the terrible knowledge of shared trauma. Then Dalton would head out to work the ranch while Marlowe, moving carefully within the limits of her healing body, continued the project of making the house livable. She washed curtains and hung them to dry in the sun. She scrubbed floors until the wood gleamed. She organized the kitchen, throwing out things that had gone bad, making lists of supplies they'd need on Dalton's next trip to town. Not Copper Falls, he assured her, but a larger settlement called Red Mesa, about 30 miles west. I don't go to Copper Falls if I can help it, he'd told her. Town's rotten. Figured that out long before what happened to you, as she worked. Marlowe began to reclaim pieces of herself that she'd thought lost. The act of creating order from chaos, of making something better through her own efforts, reminded her that she was more than just a victim, more than just the woman who'd been beaten in the street while good people watched. But it wasn't just the work that was healing her, it was Dalton himself. He was, Marlowe discovered, surprisingly easy to live with. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He was tidy without being fastidious, pulling his own weight in the household chores, even though he'd hired her specifically to handle them. He was respectful of her space and her privacy, never entering her room without knocking, never pressing her to talk about things she wasn't ready to discuss. And he was patient with her limitations. When Marlowe pushed herself too hard one day, trying to wash all the bedding in one marathon session, and ended up pale and trembling on the front porch steps, Dalton had simply finished the job himself, then brought her a glass of cool water, and sat with her in companionable silence until her breathing steadied. You don't have to prove anything, he'd said quietly. Not to me. Not to yourself. Healing takes time. I'm not used to taking time, Marlowe had replied. I'm used to just pushing through. Yeah, I know that feeling. Dalton had looked out at the horizon, his expression distant. But there's a difference between being tough and being stubborn. And pushing yourself too hard when you're healing is just stubborn. Your body's trying to fix itself. Let it do its job, Marlowe had wanted to argue, but looking at him, at this man who was clearly speaking from hard-won experience, she'd found she couldn't. So she just nodded and sipped her water and tried to accept that, maybe, just maybe, it was okay to not be okay for a while. A week passed, then 2, then 3. Marlowe's bruises faded from purple to yellow to green, then gradually disappeared. Her ribs stopped screaming with every breath and settled into a dull ache that was bearable, then barely noticeable. Her shoulder regained its range of motion. The cuts healed, leaving thin pink lines that would eventually fade to silver. And as her body healed, Marlowe found herself settling into life at the ranch in ways she hadn't anticipated. She started cooking their meals, discovering that Dalton had been understating his abilities. He was indeed functional. But Marlowe had a gift for making even simple ingredients sing. The first time she made biscuits from scratch, light and fluffy and served with butter and honey, Dalton had stared at them like she'd performed a miracle. Abigail used to make biscuits like these, he'd said quietly, and Marlowe had held her breath, waiting to see if the comparison would hurt him. But instead, he'd smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. Thank you. She also discovered that she had a way with the horses. Dalton kept 3 of them, his own mount, a rangy buckskin gelding named Smoke. a sturdy bay mare called Ash, who did most of the heavy work around the ranch, and a younger paint horse named Dust, who was still being trained. Marlowe had always liked horses, had helped her father with them on the farm when she was young, and she found herself drawn to the barn in the afternoons when the worst of the heat had passed. "You've got good hands," Dalton observed one evening, watching her brush down Ash with long, steady strokes. "Horses can tell when someone's afraid of them or trying to dominate them. You're doing neither. Just being with them. My daddy used to say that horses are honest," Marlowe replied, running the brush along Ash's neck. "They don't lie about how they're feeling or what they need. If you're willing to listen, they'll tell you everything, smart man. Your father, he was." Marlowe paused in her brushing, memory washing over her, "died when I was 15. Drought took our crops, took our livestock, took him too. Eventually, his heart just gave out from the stress of it all. Mama followed him within the year. That's when I married Henry. Didn't love him. Not really, but I needed someone to take care of me, and he needed someone to take care of his house. It worked, mostly. Until the consumption took him." She'd never said it out loud before. The truth about her marriage, about the transactional nature of what everyone in town had thought was a love match. But somehow, here in the quiet of the barn, with only Dalton and the horses to hear, it felt safe to be honest. "Did you love him?" Dalton asked. "Eventually, I mean. Did it grow into something real?" Marlowe considered the question carefully. "I cared for him. I was grateful to him. And I mourned him when he died. Because he was a good man who deserved better than being sick and alone and afraid. But love?" She shook her head. "No, I don't think I ever loved him. I'm not sure I knew how. You were young. I was desperate," Marlowe corrected. "There's a difference." They fell into silence. But it was the comfortable kind that had become familiar between them. Marlowe returned to brushing Ash, and Dalton leaned against the stall door, watching in that still way he had. "Can I ask you something?" Marlowe said after a while. "Sure. Why haven't you hired anyone else to help with the ranch? It's a lot for one man to handle alone. The horses, the cattle, the maintenance. You could afford to bring on a hand or two." Dalton was quiet for so long that Marlowe thought he might not answer. Then he sighed. "After Abigail and the kids died, I couldn't. I couldn't stand having other people around. Couldn't stand their sympathy, their careful words, the way they'd look at me like I might break at any moment. So I sent away the hands I had and decided to manage alone. Told myself it was about privacy, about not wanting strangers on my land. But really, it was about not having to see the deer eyes every day and—" "Now," Marlowe prompted gently, "now, I don't know. Having you here, it's different. You don't look at me like I'm broken. You look at me like I'm just a man. That's—" he paused, searching for words. "That's good. That's what I needed without knowing I needed it." Marlowe felt warmth spread through her chest. A feeling she hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't attraction. Exactly. Though she'd be lying if she said she hadn't noticed how Dalton looked when he was working. The strength in his shoulders, the capable grace of his movements. But it was something deeper than that. Something more fundamental. Recognition, the sense of being truly known by another person. Not as a victim or a burden or a transaction, but as an equal. "You don't look at me like I'm broken either," she said softly. "Even though I am, you're not broken," Dalton said firmly. "You're healing. There's a difference." Marlowe set down the brush and turned to face him fully. "We're both healing then. Maybe that's why this works. We're broken in ways that fit together." Dalton held her gaze, and Marlowe saw something shift in his expression. A crack in the armor he wore, a glimpse of the man he'd been before tragedy reshaped him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly it." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Marlowe couldn't quite name. Then Ash snorted and shook her head, breaking the spell, and they both laughed, a little awkwardly, a little relieved. "I should start dinner," Marlowe said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. of the warmth radiating from Dalton's body in the cool dimness of the barn. "I'll finish up here and be in shortly," Dalton replied. Stepping back to give her room to pass, Marlowe walked back to the house in the gathering dusk. Her mind churning, something was changing between them, something that went beyond simple gratitude or shared trauma. She wasn't sure what to call it yet. Wasn't sure if she should encourage it or resist it. All she knew was that for the first time since Henry died, maybe for the first time in her entire life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, the 28th night since Marlowe had arrived at Thornfield Ranch, changed everything. They'd just finished dinner. Beef stew that Marlowe had spent the afternoon making, with vegetables from the struggling garden she'd been trying to resurrect. Dalton had eaten 3 helpings and declared it the best meal he'd had in years. They were washing dishes together, a routine they'd fallen into without discussion. When Dalton suddenly went rigid, his hands stilling in the dishwater, his entire body shifting into a state of alert tension that Marlowe had never seen before. "What?" "Quiet." He dried his hands quickly and moved to the window. Peering out into the darkness beyond the lamplight, Marlowe's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "Riders. 3 of them." Coming up the road, Dalton moved to the door, his hand already on his gun. "Stay inside. Lock the door after me." "Don't come out unless I tell you to, Dalton," but he was already gone. Stepping out onto the porch, closing the door behind him, Marlowe rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass. Straining to see, 3 figures on horseback emerged from the darkness, their forms illuminated by the yellow moon hanging fat and low in the Texas sky. They stopped about 20 feet from the house, spread out in a line. Deliberate, threatening. The man in the middle was older than the other 2, maybe 50, with a scar running down the left side of his face. Visible even in the moonlight, he sat his horse with absolute confidence. The confidence of a man who'd delivered violence and knew he could deliver it again. "Dalton Thorne," the scarred man said, and his voice was surprisingly cultured, almost pleasant. "It's been a long time, not long enough." "Kane," Dalton replied. "What do you want?" Kane, the name sent ice through Marlowe's veins. She didn't know who Kane was, but the tone of Dalton's voice, the rigid set of his shoulders, told her everything she needed to know. This man was danger now. "Is that any way to greet an old acquaintance?" Kane said. "We've ridden a long way. Least you could do is offer us some water for our horses." "My well's over there." Dalton tipped his head toward the trough by the barn, without taking his eyes off the riders. "Help yourselves." "Then ride out." "Can't do that, I'm afraid. We've got business with you." "I'm out of the business. Have been for 3 years. See? That's the thing about our line of work." Kane leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "You're never really out. Not when you know what you know. Not when you've seen what you've seen." He paused. "Silas wants to talk to you." The name hit Dalton like a physical blow. Marlowe saw him flinch, saw his hand tighten on his gun, saw 3 years of carefully maintained control threaten to shatter. "Silas Crow can go to hell," Dalton said, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. "And you can tell him I said so now." "Dalton, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Dalton's laugh was harsh and ugly. "He murdered my family. He burned them alive. And you want me to be reasonable? That was business." Kane shrugged. "Nothing personal. You were getting too close, making too much noise. Silas had to send a message." "A message?" Dalton took a step forward, and Marlowe saw the 2 younger riders tense, their hands moving toward their weapons. "He killed my wife. He killed my children." That's the message he sent, and the message was received. Kane's smile widened. "You stopped chasing him. You quit the law. You disappeared." He paused. "Which is exactly what Silas wanted. But now he's got a new problem. And he thinks you might be able to help him with it." "I wouldn't help Silas Crow find water in a rainstorm. Not even if he made it worth your while? Not even if he promised to leave you alone for good? Let you live out your days in peace? On this little ranch of yours?" Kane's eyes flicked toward the house, and Marlowe knew with sick certainty that he'd seen her. "You got yourself a woman now, I hear. Pretty little thing from Copper Falls. Sure would be a shame if something happened to her." The change in Dalton was instantaneous. One moment he was standing still. The next his gun was in his hand. The barrel pointed directly at Kane's chest. The two younger riders went for their own weapons. But Dalton's voice stopped them cold. "Touch her and I'll kill all three of you before your bodies hit the ground." "That's not a threat. That's a promise." Kane raised his hand slowly, carefully, his expression never changing. "Easy now, Dalton. Nobody's threatening anybody. I'm just saying, Silas remembers what happened last time. Remembers how you lost everything, because you wouldn't stop chasing him. Seems to me you'd want to avoid a repeat of that particular tragedy." "Get off my land," Dalton said, and his voice had gone quiet again, which somehow made it more terrifying, right now. "And you tell Silas that if he or any of his men come within 10 miles of this place, I'll finish what I started 3 years ago. I'll hunt him down, and I'll make him pay for every breath he's taken since Abigail died." Big words from a man who couldn't protect his own family. Marlowe didn't see Dalton move. 1 second he was standing 10 feet from Kane's horse. The next he'd crossed the distance and dragged the man from his saddle, his gun pressed against Kane's temple, his free hand fisted in the man's shirt. "Say that again," Dalton whispered. "I dare you." The two younger riders had their guns out now, pointed at Dalton. But nobody was moving. Nobody was breathing. Marlowe's own gun was up and aimed, though she wasn't sure at which target. Wasn't sure she could even hit anything from this distance. But she'd try, God help her. If those men shot Dalton, she'd try. All right, Kane said, his cultivated calm finally cracking. "Point made. Let me up and we'll go." Dalton held him for a moment longer, and Marlowe could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The desire to pull the trigger, to end this man's life, and send a message back to Silas Crow, written in blood. But finally, slowly, he released Kane and stepped back, his gun still trained on the man's center mass. Kane climbed to his feet, dusting off his clothes with shaking hands. "You're making a mistake, Thorne. Silas is offering you a chance to square things. To put the past behind you both." He paused. "You're too damn stubborn to take it. The past can't be put behind me. Not as long as Silas Crow draws breath. Now, get on your horse and ride. Before I change my mind about letting you leave." Kane mounted up, his two companions still keeping their guns on Dalton. And for a moment, Marlowe thought it was going to go bad. Thought someone was going to shoot, and then everyone would shoot. And Dalton would die. And she'd be alone again. But Kane just nodded once, almost respectfully. "You'll be seeing us again, Thorne. Silas doesn't take no for an answer. I'll be back in 5 days with more men. Think about what you want to do. Then he can come himself," Dalton replied. "I'll be waiting." Kane turned his horse, and the three riders headed back the way they'd come, dust rising in their wake. Dalton stood watching until they crested the ridge and disappeared. And only then did he lower his gun. Marlowe was out of the house and at his side before she'd consciously decided to move. Her hand finding his arm, her touch grounding him back in the present. "Dalton," she said softly, "come." Inside, he looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes was so raw, so exposed, that Marlowe felt her heart break for him all over again. "They found me," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought I was far enough away. Thought I'd buried myself deep enough that they'd find me. But they did. Come inside," Marlowe repeated. "We need to talk. We need to make a plan." Because Marlowe Ashford had learned something in that Copper Falls street. She'd learned that running didn't work. She'd learned that hiding didn't work. She'd learned that the only thing that worked, the only thing that ever worked, was standing your ground and fighting back. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. Dalton taught Marlowe to shoot, really shoot, not just the basics he'd shown her before, but how to hit a man-sized target at 50 yards, how to reload under pressure, how to make every shot count. They fortified the house. moving furniture to create barriers, positioning weapons at strategic locations, filling buckets with water in case of fire. They'll try to burn us out, Dalton said grimly. It's what they did before. It's what they'll do again. Marlowe nodded. Her jaw set, then we'll be ready, on the fifth night. Just after midnight, the attack came. Marlowe had been sleeping fitfully when the first shot shattered her bedroom window and sent glass spraying across her bed. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, rolling off the mattress, hitting the floor hard, her hand already reaching for the rifle Dalton had positioned against the wall. Marlowe, Dalton's voice bellowed from the main room. Stay down, they're here. More shots followed, a staccato rhythm of violence that punched holes through the wooden walls and sent splinters flying. Marlowe crawled to the doorway, keeping below the windows. Through the opening, she could see Dalton crouched behind the overturned table. His rifle already firing measured shots out the front window. How many? Marlowe called. At least 10, maybe more. They've got us surrounded. Dalton fired again, and Marlowe heard a scream from outside. Can you get to the back window? Yes, go. Cover that side. Don't waste ammunition. Make every shot count. Marlowe moved in a crouch, keeping low, her rifle clutched to her chest. A bullet whined past her head. So close she felt the air displacement, but she didn't stop. There'd be time for fear later. Right now, she needed to fight. She reached the back window and peered through a gap in the shutters. In the moonlight, she got to see 3 men advancing on the house, using the barn and outbuildings as cover. One of them was reloading. Marlowe took a breath, steadied the rifle against her shoulder the way Dalton had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and the rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space. But she saw the man with the gun jerk backward and fall, her first shot at another human being, and she'd hit him. She should have felt something, horror, guilt, remorse. Instead, all she felt was a cold satisfaction, and the immediate need to find her next target. That's it. Marlowe, Dalton shouted from across the room. Keep them pinned down. The 2 remaining men at the back had found cover, but Marlowe could see them. Could see the edges of their bodies behind the water trough and the corner of the barn. She fired twice more, not hitting but forcing them to keep their heads down. Buying time from the front of the house. Dalton's rifle cracked repeatedly, each shot deliberate and controlled. Marlowe risked a glance in his direction and saw him moving between windows with fluid efficiency, never staying in one place long enough to make an easy target. This was what he'd been before, a lawman, a hunter of men, someone who'd survived through skill and speed and sheer determination. 3 years of relative peace hadn't dulled those instincts one bit. Marlowe. Reload, Dalton called, and get ready to move. They're going to try to rush us. Marlowe's hands shook slightly as she ejected the spent cartridges and fed new ones into the rifle's magazine. She'd practiced this motion dozens of times over the past 5 days. But doing it with bullets, flying and death waiting outside was entirely different from doing it in the afternoon sun. She finished reloading just as one of the men at the back broke from cover. Running low and fast toward the house, Marlowe tracked him with her rifle, led him slightly the way Dalton had taught her, and fired. The man stumbled but kept coming, and Marlowe fired again. This time he went down hard and stayed down. Good shot. Dalton's voice held approval despite the circumstances. But we've got a problem. They're trying to flank us on the east side. I need you to. His words were cut off by a new sound, the sharp crack of breaking wood from the direction of the root cellar. Marlowe's blood turned to ice. They'd talked about this possibility, about attackers trying to get into the house through the cellar entrance rather than coming through the doors or windows. Dalton. The cellar. I hear it. Stay where you are. Cover the back. Dalton was already moving, grabbing the shotgun he'd positioned specifically for close-quarters fighting. Heading toward the narrow door that led down to the root cellar, Marlowe turned back to her window. her rifle up and ready, trying to watch both her assigned position and Dalton simultaneously. The man at the back who'd been pinned behind the water trough was moving again, using his dead companion's body as cover, advancing on the house. Marlowe fired and missed, the bullet kicking up dirt 2 feet to his left. She fired again and saw blood bloom on his arm. But he kept coming, from below the house. Marlowe heard the boom of Dalton's shotgun. Then a scream, then the shotgun again. Whoever had been trying to come up through the cellar wouldn't be trying anything again. But now the man outside was at the back wall of the house, directly below Marlowe's window where she couldn't get an angle on him. She heard him moving, heard the sound of something heavy being dragged, a ladder maybe, or a barrel to stand on. He was going to try to come through the window. Marlowe backed away from the shutters, her rifle aimed at chest-height waiting. Her hands were steady now, her mind crystal clear in a way it hadn't been since before the beating in Copper Falls. She wasn't afraid, she was ready. The shutters exploded inward, blown apart by a shotgun blast from outside. And the man came through the opening head first, his gun raised. Marlowe fired without hesitation, the rifle bucking in her hands. The man's head snapped back and he fell backward out the window. Dead before he hit the ground. Marlowe, Dalton was back in the main room, his shotgun discarded in favor of his rifle again. "You all right?" "I'm fine." One came through the window. "He's dead. Good. We're down to 6. Maybe 7 of them left. But they're going to try something desperate now. Stay alert." For several minutes an eerie quiet descended over the ranch. The shooting had stopped, leaving only the sound of their own breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling. Marlowe kept her rifle trained on the back, watching for movement, while Dalton covered the front. "What are they doing?" Marlowe asked quietly, regrouping, deciding whether to cut their losses and run or... Dalton stopped suddenly, his entire body going rigid. "Oh hell, Marlowe, get away from the walls, now." Marlowe moved on instinct, not questioning, scrambling toward the center of the room, where Dalton was already positioning himself. A second later she understood why. Smoke began seeping through the gaps in the walls, acrid and thick, followed by the first orange flickers of flame. "They're burning us out," Dalton said grimly. "Must have doused the walls with lamp oil and set it. We've got maybe 5 minutes before this whole place goes up." Marlowe's mind flashed to Abigail Thorne, to the story Dalton had told her about his first family burning alive in this very house. History was trying to repeat itself, and she could see the realization hitting Dalton like a physical blow, his face going pale, his eyes unfocused, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. He was having some kind of episode, Marlowe realized, lost in the memory of finding his family's bodies, of the smoke and flames and helplessness, and they were going to die if she didn't do something. "Dalton." She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Dalton, look at me. Not then, now. We're not dying here, you hear me? We're not dying. What's the plan?" The touch, the words, the fierce urgency in her voice. It snapped something back into place. Dalton blinked, his eyes clearing, the momentary paralysis falling away. "The front door. We go out shooting. Make for the barn. Horses are saddled. I did it earlier, just in case. We mount up and ride hard for the North Trail. They'll be waiting for us. Probably." Dalton's voice was grim but steady. "But we die fighting or we die burning. And I know which one I prefer." He moved to the door, pressed his back against the wall beside it. "You ready?" Marlowe took a position on the other side of the door, her rifle held ready, and looked across at this man who'd saved her life, who'd given her a home, who'd become something she hadn't dared to name even in her own mind. "I'm with you. Whatever happens, Dalton echoed. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. He kicked the door open, and they burst through together, rifles blazing. Marlowe saw muzzle flashes from behind the water trough, from the corner of the barn, from somewhere near the chicken coop. She fired at the flashes, not aiming carefully now, just trying to put enough lead in the air to make the attackers duck. Something tugged at her skirt, a bullet passing through the fabric, and another whined past her ear, beside her. Dalton grunted in pain and stumbled, and Marlowe saw blood on his left arm, but he kept moving, kept firing, shepherding her toward the barn with his body positioned between her and the heaviest fire. They made it to the barn doorway and ducked inside, both breathing hard, and Marlowe got her first good look at Dalton's wound. The bullet had carved a furrow along his upper arm, deep enough to bleed freely but not life-threatening. "I'm fine," he said before she could ask. "Just a graze." "Get on Ash. She's the steadiest under fire. I'll take Smoke." Marlowe moved to the mare's stall, her hands shaking now that they had a moment's reprieve. Ash nickered nervously, smelling the smoke and blood. But she stood steady as Marlowe mounted, across the barn. Dalton was already on Smoke, his rifle in one hand, his injured arm clamped against his side. "When we go out, ride, low and fast. Don't stop for anything. I'll be right behind you." Dalton met her eyes. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." "Marlowe, nothing is going to happen to you," Marlowe repeated fiercely. "We're both getting out of this. We're both surviving." "That's not negotiable, despite everything." Dalton smiled. "Yes, ma'am." More shots peppered the barn, and Marlowe heard men shouting outside, organizing, preparing for another assault. The house behind them was fully engulfed now, flames shooting up into the night sky, smoke billowing in black clouds. Everything Dalton had built, destroyed again. But this time was different. This time the people inside weren't trapped and helpless. This time they were armed and angry and absolutely refusing to die. "Now!" Dalton shouted, spurring Smoke forward. They burst from the barn at a gallop, Marlowe leaning low over Ash's neck, the mare's powerful muscles surging beneath her. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, but they were moving too fast to make easy targets, and the shooters were backlit by the burning house, making them easier to see. Dalton's rifle cracked twice, and Marlowe saw a man spin and fall. She fired one-handed, the rifle awkward from horseback, but she didn't care about accuracy now. She just wanted to make the attackers think twice about standing up to shoot. They cleared the main yard and hit the trail heading north, the path Dalton had shown her during their preparations. Behind them, the shooting was fading, but Marlowe didn't slow down. She kept Ash at a full gallop, trusting the mare to navigate the moonlit trail. They'd ridden maybe a quarter-mile when Marlowe heard hoofbeats behind them. Not Dalton's horse, but multiple riders giving chase. She risked a glance back and saw 4 men on horseback, outlined against the glow of the burning ranch, pulling their mounts hard. "They're following," Marlowe shouted. "I know. Keep going." Dalton had pulled alongside her, and even in the moonlight, Marlowe could see blood staining his entire left sleeve now. The wound was worse than he'd admitted, or the hard riding was making it worse. The trail narrowed as it climbed into the hills, forcing them to single file. Marlowe took the lead, trusting Ash to find the safest path. She heard Dalton fire twice more behind her, heard one of the pursuing horses scream and stumble, heard men cursing. The trail twisted and turned, following the contours of the landscape, and Marlowe Tadu had to focus all her attention on not getting thrown or running into low-hanging branches. Behind her, she could hear Dalton's labored breathing, could sense him struggling to stay mounted. "There," Dalton called out. "The rock's on the right." "Pull in there." Marlowe saw what he meant. A jumble of large boulders that formed a natural fortress of sorts, with enough space behind them for the horses, but defensible from a few positions. She guided Ash into the shelter and dismounted quickly, her rifle already coming up. Dalton pulled in beside her and half fell from his horse, catching himself against Smoke's saddle. Up close, Marlowe could see how much blood he'd lost, could see the pallor of his skin and the way his hands shook. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "You're not fine. Let me look at it. No time." "There." Dalton stopped, cocking his head to listen. The sound of pursuing hoofbeats had stopped. Marlowe strained her ears, but heard nothing except the wind in the scrub brush and the heavy breathing of their horses. "Where are they?" she whispered. "Out there. Somewhere. Probably splitting up, trying to flank us. Or waiting for daylight." Dalton slid down the boulder until he was sitting, his rifle across his lap. "We're pinned here. Can't move without them hearing us. And I can't ride much further anyway." Marlowe's mind raced through their options. They were 4 or 5 miles from the ranch. Maybe 2 miles from the main road where they might find help. Dawn was still hours away. Dalton was injured and losing blood. They had limited ammunition. Marlowe checked her pockets and found she had maybe 15 rounds left for the rifle. Dalton probably had more, but not much. "All right," Marlowe said, making a decision. "You stay here. I'll go for help. Red Mesa is—" "No." Dalton's voice was firm despite his obvious pain. "You don't know the way well enough, and if they catch you alone, you're dead. We stay together. You need a doctor. That arm will keep for a few more hours." "I've had worse." Dalton pulled a bandana from his pocket and tied it awkwardly around his wound. Using his teeth to tighten the knot, "Come first light, we'll reassess. But right now we dig in and wait." Marlowe wanted to argue, wanted to do something other than just sit here while Dalton bled. But she recognized the logic of his words. Moving now in the dark, with armed men hunting them, would be suicidal. So she positioned herself at the edge of their rocky shelter, her rifle aimed out at the darkness, and settled in to wait. Beside her she could hear Dalton's breathing growing more labored, could smell the copper tang of blood on the night air. "Tell me something," Dalton said, after a long silence. "Something good. Something from before everything went to hell." Marlowe thought for a moment, reaching back through her memories for something untainted by loss and pain. "When I was 7, she said quietly, "my father took me to San Antonio for the first time. Just the two of us. Mama was sick, so it was this special trip. We stayed in a real hotel, ate in a restaurant, walked around the city looking at everything. And there was this street musician playing a fiddle, the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. And my father gave me a penny to put in his hat." "What did he play?" Dalton asked. His voice drowsy. "Shenandoah. I didn't know the name then. But I learned it later, and for years after. Whenever I heard that song, I'd think of that day, of my father's hand in mine, of the sun on my face, of being happy and safe and loved." Marlowe's voice caught slightly. "That's what I hold on to when things get dark. That memory, that feeling, that's good," Dalton murmured. "That's real good." "Marlowe." He fell silent after that, and Marlowe listened to his breathing, counting the intervals, making sure they stayed steady. She wanted to check on him more thoroughly, wanted to do something about the blood he was losing, but she didn't dare take her attention off the darkness surrounding them. Horrors crawled past. Marlowe's eyes burned with the effort of staring into the shadows, her ears straining for any sound that might indicate approaching danger. The temperature dropped as the night progressed, and she wished she'd grabbed a coat before they fled, wished she could do something to keep Dalton warm. Finally, imperceptibly at first, but the sky began to lighten in the east. Dawn was coming, bringing with it both hope and danger. They'd be able to see their attackers, but their attackers would be able to see them too, as the gray light strengthened. Marlowe saw movement about 50 yards out, a man rising from behind a rock, stretching stiff muscles. Clearly thinking the people he was hunting were either long gone or dead, Marlowe raised her rifle carefully, sighted on the man's center mass, and hesitated. She'd killed men during the attack on the house. At least 2. Probably 3, but those had been in the heat of battle. Split-second decisions made in chaos and fear. This was different. This was deliberate. Calculated. This was cold-blooded killing. And something in Marlowe rebelled against it. "Do it," Dalton said quietly from behind her. "He won't hesitate to kill you if the positions were reversed." Marlowe knew he was right. These men had burned Dalton's house, had tried to murder them both. Would try again given the chance. This wasn't murder. This was survival. She squeezed the trigger, the man dropped, and immediately, 2 other locations erupted with gunfire. The other pursuers, revealing their positions as they shot at. Where they'd seen Marlowe's muzzle flash, bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, spraying them with stone chips. Marlowe ducked back into cover and looked at Dalton. His face was gray now. His lips bloodless, but his eyes were still sharp. 3 more, he said. Maybe 4. Can't quite tell. We can't stay here. You need medical attention. I need to not get shot again, more than I need medical attention. Give me your rifle. You reload mine. Dalton took her rifle and positioned himself at a different angle. His movements slow but deliberate. Marlowe quickly reloaded his rifle, her hands moving through the familiar motions with practiced efficiency. As she worked, she heard Dalton fire twice, then grunt with satisfaction. 1 down, clipped another. Saw him fall back. How many rounds do we have left? Not enough for a prolonged fight. We need to end this soon. Dalton handed back Marlowe's rifle and took his own. There's a gully about 30 yards to our left, runs north toward the main road. If we can make it there, we can use it for cover and keep moving, but we'll be exposed for maybe 10 seconds getting to it. 10 seconds is a long time to be a target. You have a better idea? Marlowe didn't. She checked her rifle one more time, made sure her pistol was secure in her waistband, and nodded. I'm ready when you are. We go on 3, you run. I'll cover you. When you're safe, you cover me. Understood, understood. Dalton took a deep breath, steadying himself. 1, 2, 3. Marlowe burst from cover and ran, her legs pumping, her lungs burning, every second expecting to feel a bullet tear into her back. Gunfire erupted behind her, Dalton laying down covering fire. And she heard bullets whining past her head, but she didn't stop, didn't slow down, just ran until she reached the gully and threw herself into it. She rolled, came up with her rifle ready, and saw Dalton stumbling toward her, his face a mask of pain and determination. Behind him, she saw a man rise from cover, taking careful aim at Dalton's back. Marlowe fired without conscious thought. The man jerked and fell, and Dalton made it to the gully, collapsing beside her with a gasp. Good shot. He managed. Saved my life. We're even now, Marlowe replied, helping him sit up. His wound had opened up again during the run, blood flowing freely. Come on. We need to keep moving. They moved down the gully, using it as cover, stopping every few yards so Dalton could rest. Marlowe kept her rifle ready, watching their back trail for pursuit, but after several minutes of seeing and hearing nothing, she began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten away. They'd traveled perhaps half a mile when Marlowe heard the most beautiful sound she'd ever encountered. The jingle of harness and the rumble of wagon wheels on the main road just ahead and above them. Hello, Marlowe shouted, climbing up out of the gully. Help, we need help, the wagon, a freight wagon heading east, pulled to a stop, and a grizzled teamster peered down at her with wide eyes. Miss, you all right? You're covered in blood and it's not my blood. My friend is injured. We were attacked. Please. We need to get to Red Mesa. To a doctor, the teamster didn't ask questions. He climbed down and helped Marlowe get Dalton up and into the wagon bed, then whipped his team into the fastest pace they could manage. Marlowe cradled Dalton's head in her lap, pressing her hand against his wound to slow the bleeding, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. Stay with me, she said. You don't get to die after everything we've been through. You hear me, Dalton Thorne? You stay with me. Dalton's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with obvious effort. Not dying, he mumbled. Too stubborn. That's right, you're too stubborn. We're both too stubborn. Just hold on a little longer. Red Mesa appeared on the horizon, its buildings growing larger as the wagon raced toward them. The teamster was shouting now, alerting the town to their approach, and Marlowe saw people emerging from buildings. Saw a man in a marshal's badge running toward them. The wagon pulled up in front of a building with a sign reading, Dr. Walsh. physician and surgeon, and suddenly there were hands helping her down. Helping to carry Dalton inside, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed spectacles took one look at Dalton and started barking orders. "Get him on the table. You boil water. You. Fetch my surgical kit, miss. I need you to step outside while I work." "No," Marlowe said flatly. "I'm staying." The doctor looked ready to argue. But something in Marlowe's expression made him reconsider. "Fine. But stay out of my way for the next hour." Marlowe stood against the wall and watched Dr. Walsh work to save Dalton's life. He cleaned the wound, probed for bullet fragments, stitched torn flesh back together with small, precise movements. Through it all, Dalton drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious, once calling out for Abigail before his eyes opened and found Marlowe. And he remembered the grief and guilt flashing across his face before the laudanum the doctor had given him pulled him back under. Finally, the doctor straightened. Wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth, "He'll live. Lost a lot of blood, and there's always a risk of infection. But he's strong and healthy otherwise. He should make a full recovery with rest and proper care." Marlowe felt her knees buckle with relief, and she caught herself against the wall. "Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. That's only half your problem solved." The doctor gestured toward the door, where the marshal now stood. "The marshal's going to want to know what happened, and from the looks of both of you, it's one hell of a story." Marlowe looked at the marshal, a lean man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense expression, and straightened her spine. She'd survived a beating. She'd survived an attack. She'd killed men in defense of her life and Dalton's. Whatever came next, she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything else, standing up, fighting back, refusing to yield. "It is one hell of a story, Marshal," she said, "and you're going to want to hear every word of it. Because the man behind this, Silas Crowe, he's not going to stop. Not unless someone stops him first." The marshal's eyes sharpened with interest. "Silas Crowe. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. Come with me. Miss, let's talk about what happened, and then let's talk about what we're going to do about it." The marshal's name was Thomas Kane, not related to the scarred man who'd threatened them. He was quick to clarify that. But he knew of him, Kane Rook, Silas Crowe's right hand, mean as a snake and twice as poisonous. If he was at your ranch, then Silas is serious about whatever he wants from Dalton. They sat in the marshal's office, Marlowe with a cup of coffee she couldn't drink, her hands still shaking from adrenaline and fear and relief. She'd told him everything: the attack, the fire, the chase, the men she'd killed. Kane had listened without interrupting, taking notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "You did right," he said when she finished. "Everything you did was in defense of your life and Dalton's. No jury in Texas would convict you for it, but," Marlowe prompted, because she could hear the hesitation in his voice, "but Silas Crowe doesn't care about juries or laws. He's going to come after you again, both of you. And next time he'll bring more men, better men. He doesn't like to lose, so what do? We go after him first." Marshal Kane leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I've been trying to build a case against Silas for 2 years now, but he's careful, keeps his hands clean, uses men like Kane Rook to do his dirty work. And every witness we find either disappears or changes their story." He paused, but now he's made a mistake. He attacked a law-abiding citizen on his own property, burned his house, tried to kill him. That's not something I can ignore. That's not something the territorial governor can ignore. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we assemble a posse. Good men. Men who know how to handle themselves in a fight. And we go into Scorpion Canyon where Silas has his hideout, and we bring him in. Dead or alive. Marlowe's heart began to pound. How many men? I can get maybe 10, 12 if we're lucky. Silas probably has twice that. But we'll have surprise on our side and the law. That counts for something. And Dalton? Dalton stays here, recovers. He's in no shape to ride. Marshal Kane met Marlowe's eyes. But I'd like you to come, if you're willing. Dalton trusts you, and once we have Silas in custody, I'll need Dalton's testimony to make the charges stick. Having you there to convince him to cooperate might be the difference between justice and another 3 years of Silas running free. Marlowe didn't hesitate. I'll come. It's going to be dangerous. More dangerous than what you've already been through, I know. You might not come back. I know that too. Marlowe set down her coffee cup. Her hands steady now, but I'm tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Tired of men like Silas Crow and Gideon Mercer thinking they can hurt people and get away with it. So yes, Marshal, I'll come, and I'll do whatever it takes to see Silas Crow brought to justice. Marshal Kane nodded slowly, respect dawning in his eyes. You're a hell of a woman, Miss Ashford. Dalton's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Marlowe replied softly, and meant it. 3 days later, Marlowe stood in Dr. Walsh's surgery and looked down at Dalton. He was awake now, lucid. The fever that had gripped him for the first 48 hours finally broken. But he was still weak, still pale, still in no condition to ride. You're going after Silas, he said. Not a question. A statement, yes, Marlowe. Don't, she cut him off. Don't try to talk me out of it. This needs to end. You know it does. And Marshal Kane needs someone who can convince you to testify once we bring Silas in. I don't need convincing. Good. Then it'll be an easy job. Dalton tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillows. Damn it. Marlowe, I should be going. Not you. You can barely sit up. How exactly are you going to ride for 2 days through rough country? I'll manage. You'll die, Marlowe said flatly. Or you'll slow everyone down and get them killed. Is that what you want? Dalton closed his eyes, frustration and pain warring on his face. No. Then trust me. Trust Marshal Kane. Trust that we can do this. Marlowe reached out and took his hand. I'm not the same woman you found bleeding in that Copper Falls street. You helped me become someone stronger. Someone who fights back. Let me fight. For you. For us. For everyone Silas has hurt. Dalton squeezed her hand. Promise me you'll come back. I promise, Marlowe. I promise. Dalton, I'll come back to you. And when I do, this will be over. Silas will answer for what he did to Abigail and your children, and we can finally, start living instead of just surviving. Dalton pulled her down into an awkward embrace, his good arm wrapped around her. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I didn't think I'd ever say those words again. But I love you, and I need you to know that before you go. Marlowe felt tears spring to her eyes. I love you too, she whispered back. I'll come back. I swear it. They held each other for a long moment, then Marlowe pulled away, wiping her eyes. I have to go. Marshal Kane is waiting, Marlowe. She turned back at the door. Shoot straight, stay low, and if it comes down to it, save yourself. Don't try to be a hero, Marlowe smiled. You first. Then she was gone, out into the morning sunlight where 12 men on horseback waited. Marshal Kane in the lead, and beside him, a horse already saddled for her. Ash, the mare Dalton had told them to bring. Marlowe mounted up, settled the rifle across her saddle, and looked at the men around her, hard men, seasoned men. Men who knew what they were riding toward. Everyone clear on the plan? Marshal Kane asked. A chorus of affirmatives. Then let's ride. We've got a long way to go. And a devil to catch, they turned their horses west, toward Scorpion Canyon, toward Silas Crow, toward whatever justice looked like when the law finally caught up with evil. And Marlowe Ashford, once beaten and left for dead in the dust of Copper Falls, rode with her head high and her spine straight, ready for whatever came next. They reached Scorpion Canyon 2 days later. Just after dawn on the 3rd day of their journey, the canyon was well named, a narrow slash in the red rock country, treacherous and twisting, with sheer walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side, perfect for an ambush, perfect for hiding, perfect for a man like Silas Crow. Marshal Kane called a halt just out of sight of the canyon entrance. This is it, he said, addressing the assembled posse. Intel says Silas has maybe 20 men holed up in there, old mining camp about 3 miles in. Buildings made of stone. Hard to burn, hard to storm. He paused. We're not going to storm it. We're going to smoke them out. Half of us will approach from the main entrance, make noise. Make them think that's the only threat. The other half will circle around, come in from the back trail. Catch them between us. What if they don't come out? One of the men asked. Then we wait. They have to get water from the creek that runs through the canyon. Eventually they'll have to expose themselves, and when they do, we take them. Marshal Kane looked at Marlowe, Miss Ashford. You'll be with my group, coming in from the back. I want you positioned on the high ground where you can cover the approach. You're a good shot. Use that. Marlowe nodded, her stomach tight with nerves and anticipation. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. They split into two groups. 6 men with Marshal Kane. 6 with his deputy approaching from the front. Marlowe followed Kane and his men as they circled wide around the canyon. Using the rough country to stay hidden, it took them 2 hours of hard riding to reach the position Kane wanted, a ridge overlooking the back entrance to the canyon. With clear sight lines to the old mining camp below, Marlowe positioned herself behind a large boulder, her rifle resting on the stone, her ammunition laid out within easy reach. From here she could see the entire camp. Maybe a dozen buildings, some intact, some half-collapsed. And in the center, a large stone structure that looked like it had once been the mine office. That's where Silas would be, Marlowe thought. In the most defensible position, she settled in to wait, watching the camp through the morning light, seeing men move between buildings, see smoke rising from cook fires. They had no idea what was coming. Then, right on schedule, she heard gunfire from the front of the canyon. The deputies' group announcing their presence. The effect on the camp was immediate. Men running, shouting, grabbing weapons, organizing themselves for defense. She saw a tall man with silver hair emerge from the stone building. Silas crowed even, from this distance. Marlowe could see the command in his bearing, the way men deferred to him. He was pointing, directing, sending most of his men toward the front entrance, leaving only a handful to guard the back. Dalton Kane waited until the majority of Silas's men had committed to the front. Then he gave the signal, and his group rode down into the canyon. Guns blazing, Marlowe provided covering fire from above, picking her targets carefully. A man raising a rifle toward Marshal Kane, she shot him. Another trying to flank Kane's group from the side, she shot him too. The fight was brutal and chaotic, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Smoke from burning powder drifting across the camp, men screaming, horses screaming. The acrid smell of blood and gunpowder. Marlowe saw Kane Rook, the scarred man who'd threatened them at the ranch, emerge from one of the buildings, his gun raised toward Marshal Kane's back. Marlowe tracked him with her rifle, led him slightly, and fired, but the bullet went wide. Kicking up dust at his feet, Kane Rook spun, looking for the source of the shot, and his eyes locked on Marlowe's position. He smiled and started climbing toward her. Marlowe fired again and again. But he was using the rocks for cover, moving fast, getting closer. She was reaching for her pistol when he came over the boulder. Moving faster than a man his age should be able to move, his hand closing around her rifle, yanking it from her grip. Then his other hand was at her throat, squeezing. You should have stayed on that ranch. Little girl, Kane Rook said, his scarred face inches from hers. Should have let the men handle this. Marlowe couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, but she could move. She drove her knee up into his groin with all the strength she had. Kane grunted and his grip loosened slightly. It was enough. Marlowe twisted, broke free, and drove her head backward into his face. She heard cartilage crunch, felt blood spray. Kane staggered, his hands going to his broken nose. And Marlowe grabbed her pistol from her waistband, put it against his chest, and fired. Kane Rook fell, his eyes wide with surprise, then blank. Marlowe stood over him, breathing hard, her hands shaking. She'd killed him in cold blood, up close, looking into his eyes. And she felt nothing, no guilt, no remorse, just a grim satisfaction that one more of Silas's monsters was dead. She picked up her rifle and returned to her position. The fight below was winding down. Most of Silas's men were dead or surrendered, and she could see Marshal Kane and his men converging on the stone building. Where Silas Crow had barricaded himself inside, Marlowe climbed down from her perch, moving carefully over the rocky terrain. By the time she reached the camp, Marshal Kane had Silas surrounded. "Come out." "Crow," Kane was shouting. "It's over. Your men are dead or captured. You've got nowhere to go." Silence from inside the building, then, incredibly, a voice, "I want to talk to Thorne. Bring me Dalton Thorne and I'll surrender." "Thorne's not here," Marshal Kane replied. "And you're in no position to make demands. Then I guess we're at an impasse." More silence. Marlowe moved up beside Marshal Kane. "Let me try," she said quietly. "Miss Ashford, I know what he took from Dalton. Maybe I can convince him that more death won't bring it back." Marshal Kane hesitated, then nodded. Marlowe stepped forward, her rifle held loosely but ready. "Silas Crow," she called out. "My name is Marlowe Ashford. I'm the woman Dalton Thorne pulled from the street in Copper Falls. The woman your men tried to burn alive in his house." Pause. "Dalton's not here because he's recovering from the bullet wound your men gave him. But I'm here. And I'm telling you, this ends now. You can come out and face justice. Or you can die in there. Your choice." The door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, silver-haired, with a burn scar covering half his face. 48 years old, but looking older. Harder Silas Crow. He was unarmed, his hands raised, but there was no fear in his eyes. Only calculation. "You must be special," he said to Marlowe. "For Dalton to care about you this much. He didn't care this much about his own family. Let them die while he was off chasing me." "He cared," Marlowe said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "He cared enough to rebuild his life. To try again. To save someone when he couldn't save them." She paused. "And now you're going to pay for what you took from him." Silas smiled. "We'll see." Marshal Kane moved forward, pulling out iron shackles. "Silas Crow, I'm arresting you for murder, arson, armed robbery, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way back to town. You have the right to." "I know my rights," Silas said, holding out his wrists for the shackles. And just like that, it was over. The monster was caught, the hunt was finished. Justice, finally, would be served. Marlowe watched as they loaded Silas onto a horse, his hands bound, his face impassive, and she thought about Dalton, lying in that bed in Red Mesa, waiting for news. She thought about Abigail and Nathaniel and Rosalie, who died 3 years ago in flames and terror, and she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been in Copper Falls, and the woman she'd become stronger, harder, unbroken. They had him. Now came the hard part, making sure justice stuck. 3 months later, on a cold November morning, Marlowe Ashford stood in the main street of Austin, Texas, watching a man climb 13 steps to a wooden platform. Silas Crow. The trial had lasted 2 weeks. The testimony devastating. Witness after witness describing murders, arsons, robberies. A trail of destruction that stretched across half of Texas, Dalton had testified. His voice strong and clear as he described finding his family's bodies. The message carved into the barn door. The 3 years of grief that followed. The jury had deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging, and now, on this gray November morning, with frost still clinging to the ground, justice would finally be served. Dalton stood beside Marlowe, his left arm still weak from the bullet wound but healing. His hand found hers in the crowd, their fingers lacing together, not hiding, not anymore. They'd earned the right to stand together in daylight, on the platform. Silas Crow surveyed the crowd with those cold eyes. No remorse, no fear, just calculation. Even now, the hangman read the charges, his voice carrying across the assembled witnesses. Marlowe felt Dalton's hand tighten on hers. "You don't have to watch," she whispered. "Yes, I do need to see it end. Need to know he's really gone. The hangman placed the noose around Silas's neck, asked if he had any last words. Silas's eyes found Dalton in the crowd. You think you won. Thorne, you still lost Abigail. Still didn't save your kids. And me? He smiled. I'll be dead, but I'll haunt you forever. Dalton's voice rang out clear and strong. No, you taught me something about choices. I can choose the pain, or I can choose to live. The trapdoor opened. Silas Crow dropped, the rope snapped taut, and just like that. After 3 years of grief and rage and guilt, it was over. Dalton let out a long, shuddering breath and turned to Marlowe. It's done. Finally done. She squeezed his hand. Now what? Now we go home. Build something new. Live the life they'd want us to live. They left Austin the next morning, heading back toward Red Mesa, and the future they'd begun whispered conversations during Dalton's recovery, not back to Thornfield Ranch. That place was ash and memory now. But Dalton owned land elsewhere, 12 miles west of Red Mesa, near a clear running stream the locals called Silverwater Creek good land. Better soil, room to build something that belonged to both of them as they rode. Dalton told her his plan, new house, one that's ours, no ghosts, just future. I've been thinking about the design. Stone foundation, wide porch facing the sunrise. Room to grow if he stopped. Suddenly shy. If we what? Marlowe prompted. If we want to, someday. I mean, we haven't talked about, that is. I should probably ask you properly first. Marlowe had never seen him fumble for words before. Found it endearing, found her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Ask me what? Dalton? He pulled his horse to a stop, reached into his saddlebag, and pulled out a small wooden box. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside, a simple gold band. I built that first house for Abigail. Built it with love and hope and dreams that died when she did. This new place, I want to build it with you. For you, for us. He met her eyes. Marlowe Ashford, will you marry me? Will you stand with me and build a life together? I know I come with baggage and ghosts and a past that's complicated. I know I'm not easy, but I love you. More than I thought I'd ever love anyone again. And I want whatever time I have left to be spent making you happy. Marlowe felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. Joyful tears. Yes, I'll marry you, Dalton Thorne. I'll stand with you and build with you and love you for however long we both shall live. He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and it was everything a kiss should be. Sweet and passionate, and full of promise when they pulled apart. Both were crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of finding each other, of surviving everything that had tried to break them, of standing here together, two broken people who'd become stronger in the mending. They were married a week later in Red Mesa's small church, with Marshal Kane giving Marlowe away, and Dr. Walsh and his wife standing as witnesses. Marlowe wore a dress Margaret Walsh had helped her make. Simple blue calico that made her eyes shine. Dalton wore his best clothes and looked nervous and happy and more alive than Marlowe had ever seen him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. When Dalton kissed her in front of God and everyone, Marlowe felt a completeness she'd never known before. She wasn't just Mrs. Thorne now. She was Marlowe Thorne, partner and equal. A woman who'd been beaten down but had risen again. Who'd found love in the aftermath of violence. Who'd proven that broken things could indeed be made stronger in the mending. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, they returned to Thornfield, to the place where Dalton's first family had died, where he and Marlowe had nearly died, where everything had burned, the house was gone. Nothing left but the stone foundation and a lone chimney reaching toward the sky. Weeds had already begun reclaiming the space, not sure indifferent to human tragedy. Dalton dismounted and stood looking at the ruins for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he walked to what had been the front entrance, knelt down, and carefully placed something on the foundation stones. The photograph, the only photograph from the old house that had survived Abigail, Nathaniel, Rosalie, young and happy and alive, Abby, Nate, Rosalie. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. I'm sorry. So sorry I couldn't save you, couldn't protect you. But I promise, I'll live well. I'll live the kind of life that would make you proud. I'll love and be loved, and I'll never forget you. Never. Marlowe stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Silent support. After a moment, Dalton stood, wiped his eyes, and turned to her. Ready to go home? Marlowe nodded. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving the photograph on the foundation. The wind caught it, lifted it slightly. But it settled back down, caught in a crack between stones, not flying away, just resting, a marker of what was, but no longer a chain holding anyone to the past. By spring, the new house was rising, simple but solid, stone and wood and honest craftsmanship. Dalton and Marlowe worked side by side, sawing boards, hammering nails, building something that belonged to both of them, equally. Dotto Shawl. Kane stopped by with supplies and news from town. Dr. Walsh and Margaret brought food and laughter, and the comfortable presence of friends who'd become family. The house took shape slowly, room by room, beam by beam, and as it grew, so did Dalton and Marlowe's relationship. They learned each other's rhythms. The comfortable dance of two people building a shared life. They had their first real argument over where to position the kitchen stove. Marlowe won. They celebrated their first harvest from the garden. Marlowe, they broke in the new barn, with a gathering of neighbors who welcomed her, like she'd always belonged. They sat on the unfinished porch at sunset and talked about everything and nothing. And slowly, carefully, they built not just a house but a home. Not perfect. Nothing ever was, but theirs. Completely and absolutely theirs, on a warm evening in late May. Nearly a year after Marlowe had been beaten in the streets of Copper Falls. She and Dalton sat on their finished porch and watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Do you ever regret it? Marlowe asked. Pulling me from that street? Your life would have been simpler without me. Dalton looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Simpler, maybe, but also empty, meaningless, dead in all the ways that matter. You didn't complicate my life, Marlowe. You saved it. Just like I saved yours. We saved each other, Marlowe corrected, leaning into his embrace. That's what people who love each other do from inside the house. They could hear the sounds of construction still ongoing. The place not quite finished, but lived in anyway, because home wasn't about perfection. Home was about presence, about showing up, about choosing each other day after day after day. Marlowe thought back to that day in Copper Falls, to lying in the dust and believing she was going to die alone and forgotten. She thought about Gideon Mercer's boots, fists, about the faces of people who'd watched and done nothing, about how close she'd come to simply giving up. And then she thought about the sound of hoofbeats, about gray eyes and gentle hands, about a voice saying, I don't ride past anymore, and meaning it. That day had been the worst of her life and the beginning of her salvation. The beating had broken her, but the breaking had led her here. To this porch, this man, this life. She'd been beaten down, but she'd risen. She'd been left for dead, but she'd survived. She'd lost everything, but she'd found something better. The sun was setting now, painting the Texas sky in shades of fire and gold. Marlowe watched it, Dalton's arm around her waist, and felt a profound sense of peace. She'd faced the darkness and come through it. She'd stood when the world tried to keep her down. She'd loved when it seemed impossible to love again. She was Marlowe Thorne, survivor, fighter, wife, woman who'd been beaten but never broken. And every breath she took, every moment of joy she experienced, was a victory over every person who'd ever tried to make her feel like less than she was. Gideon Mercer had tried to destroy her in that Copper Falls street. Silas Crowe had tried to finish the job. Both had failed, and Marlowe knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never fall again. She would stand, with Dalton beside her, with her head high and her spine straight. For all the days of her life, the woman who'd been beaten in the dust was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, more complete, Someone who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. Someone who'd learned that true strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up. About choosing to keep going. About refusing to let the cruelty of others define your story. Marlowe Ashford had fallen, but Marlowe Thorne would stand forever. And that, she thought, as Dalton kissed her temple and the last light faded from the sky, was the best victory of all. Not vengeance, not violence, not becoming what they were, but living, loving, building something beautiful from broken pieces. That was how you won. That was how you survived. That was how you turned dust and ashes into something that shone. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Dalton pulled Marlowe closer, and she leaned into him, into this man, this life, this hard-won peace, somewhere in the distance. A coyote called Marlowe Thorne, who'd once lain broken in the dust of Copper Falls, smiled, because she'd learned the truth that day in the street. You don't have to stay down. You just have to choose to stand. And she had chosen every single day since. She would keep choosing for the rest of her life.